Dan, it's so great to be here at the Cotswolds Distillery. I was driving down here just in the middle of nowhere. It's so picturesque and refreshing and wonderful. And yet your cafe and your business here is just full of people. It's just a wonderful thing to see. You come from New York via London, where you're in finance. This has got to be a lot more fun than finance.
It's a lot more fun. I spent 30 years in a slightly loveless career in finance, and always wanted to do something that I cared about, and I really wanted to make something with my own hands, and or with collective hands. But this certainly fits the bill. It's been a terrific experience.
Yeah. What was your first experience with whiskey? Your first exposure to it?
So it was probably, I was living in Paris when I first really got bitten by the whiskey bug. I was in Paris for about 11 years, and little known fact, French are one of the world's largest consumers of single malt whiskey. And I went to an evening hosted by the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society, where we were tasting a whole bunch of single casks, and that's when I realized the magic of single malt, and particularly of single cask whiskey. And then I started learning more about it through a wonderful store in Paris called the Maison de Whiskey. I had a whiskey club back then, and I was one of their members. And I started going off on a yearly boys tour up to Scotland to visit distilleries, and that's what really got me into it.
Yeah, and of course, the Maison de Whiskey import quite a few American whiskies and distribute them around Europe now, aren't they?
They do, and they import our whiskey into France, and France is now one of our top export markets. We're in 40 countries, but France is sort of number one or number two or number three, somewhere right in the top three, basically. But it's really nice to see the appreciation for our story, our reality, our authenticity, and the quality of our spirits.
Yeah, absolutely. How has that success been achieved? Because taking a whiskey from the Cotswolds as opposed to Speyside or the islands, that's got to be a big ask. Is it just purely down to the quality of your whiskey? You've got a really good marketing team?
Well, I didn't know a thing about making whiskey. In fact, I didn't know anything about the drinks business. I didn't even know I was going into the drinks business. I just kind of thought I wanted to build a beautiful distillery and make a beautiful product in a beautiful part of the world. And one of the Scottish distilleries I fell in love with was Bruichladdich out on Islay, and I really loved the way they positioned themselves, and they were really all about the people who worked there and the place, and they were a little bit out of the box in terms of their marketing. And so one day, looking out the window of the farmhouse that we live in, about 3 miles away from here, I saw a big field of spring barley, and I thought to myself, there's all this barley in the Cotswolds, and it's every bit as sort of romantic and visually sort of emotionally arresting as is Scotland. Why hasn't anyone made any whiskey here? Because there's 30 plus million people a year that come to visit, so some of them surely must like to come and see distilleries and taste whiskey. So that was how it all got its start.
Yeah, absolutely. Describe the feeling after the 3 years and 1 day where you actually first tasted your own whiskey.
Well, so it was unbelievable, but I must say that we kind of knew. I think it took us about 3 or 4 months after we started distilling to get to the point where I felt it's going to be okay. I mean, I took my life savings basically and invested in this. And you're investing your life savings in something you have no idea whether it's going to work and whether you're going to make a good whiskey. And my goal was always basically just to make a whiskey I would want to drink in a distillery I would want to visit. I didn't know anything else because I was just a consumer, really. So because of that humility, because of that lack of knowledge and the admission of that, I wanted to make sure if this was my life savings, I was hiring the best consultants, the best mentors, really, to show us the process in order to arrive at the best whiskey. And we had 2 amazing Scottish gentlemen with over 100 years of whiskey making experience between them, Harry Coburn and later the late, great Dr. Jim Swan, who helped us. And they worked with us very intensively for a couple of months on our whiskey making process, to the point where within about 3 months from when the first whiskey came off the stills, we were making new make spirit, the base distillate, which is the DNA of all of our whiskeys, that was really good. And what they say in this business, if the new make's good, the whiskey's going to be good. So within 3 months, I started kind of feeling like things were okay, but then we started using these amazingly active casks, which just put so much flavor and character into the whiskey so much sooner than some of the slightly dodgy wood that sometimes big distilleries have to use because they have so much wood and they empty casks so often. So with these amazing casks, I'd say within 6 further months, so that was by the summer of 15, so 9 months into it, we already kind of said, the whiskey, this is pretty good stuff. But of course, as you say, we had to wait for 3 years and a day. And when that time finally came, amazingly, that 3 years and 1 day came on day one of Whiskey Live in Paris. And Whiskey Live in Paris is Europe's largest whiskey show and probably one of the most important ones in the world. And so the marketing side of me thought to myself, this is too good an opportunity to miss. We could actually give birth to a whiskey on a stand at a whiskey show. So we decanted some of one of our casks into a smaller cask because it has to stay in wood 3 years and a day. We brought it to Paris with us, and with flourish, at 10 o'clock in the morning on day one of Whiskey Live Paris on our stand, we pumped out a bottle. We brought a bunch of empty bottles, and we had the first bottle ever of Cotswold single malt that saw the light of day in the very place that I got turned on to whiskey back in 2000. So
absolutely amazing. The romanticism is just brilliant, isn't it?
It was great. Yeah,
now, on talking about casks, you were initially started with red wine and bourbon casks. Now you moved on. You've got some sherry, and some other variations as well, I believe.
Absolutely. Well, we always, the fun of whiskey, the whole story behind the whiskey is that it starts life as hopefully a really nice and balanced distillate, but of course, as everybody always says, probably 2/3 of what you taste in the whiskey comes from that aging and the wood itself. And different types of wood will impart different flavors, and that's the fun, that's the variety, that's the mystique, really, of whiskey, is that it evolves, it follows its course, it ebbs, it flows, it changes with the wood, with the season, with the weather, with the type of warehouse it's stored in. One thing I knew was that we were always going to use the best of everything. There was no reason not to. Because basically I wasn't going to do this a second time in my life, and I wasn't going to risk my life savings on something that wasn't, again, a whiskey that I would want to drink. So we buy the best locally made, locally farmed barley. We floor malt all of it, which is a pretty expensive process. And then when it comes to putting it into wood, we buy the best wood money can buy. And now, where do you buy the best wood? I wouldn't have known had it not been for Jim Swan, who had a little black book of all the best coopers in the world. So Jim basically said, if you want bourbons, call Tim in Kentucky. If you want, great wine casks, call the guys in Portugal. And if you want great sherry wood, call Miguel in Spain. And that's what we did. And we, from the beginning, actually filled all these wonderful casks. Our first whiskey was, as you said, a blend of those wonderful first fill bourbon casks from Kentucky with our really unique shaved, toasted, and recharred ex-red wine casks known as STRs. But we always plan on building a core range around the different types of wood in our wood program. So our first sort of single type of cask whiskey was our Founder's Choice, which is 100% STR. Our second was our peated cask, which is our whiskey aged in ex-Lafroy quarter casks. Then it was on to the sherry cask, which was a blend of various amazing sherry casks, different types of sherry, different types of wood, and different size casks. But what all these have in common is that they are all full-term maturation. We don't believe in what is called finishing. We don't believe, and finishing is essentially letting your whiskey sit for years and years and years in a slightly dead cask, shall we say, that doesn't impart any flavor, and then putting it in something at the very end just to pick up a little flavor. You might as well just put a couple teaspoons of sherry into your whiskey. We believe in full-term maturation, so we believe in taking new make whiskey, putting it in that sherry cask, putting it in that port cask or that sauterne cask, and letting it live its whole life in that wood. And that's given us some pretty wonderful taste. We have a limited edition called Hearts and Crafts, which has some weird and wonderful casks. We've done a sauterne cask release. We've done a Pinot de Charente release, and there's lots more on the horizon.
Yeah. Just on the cask element, on the peated element, Eventually, you don't actually introduce the peat in the malting, do you? It actually comes just from the cask.
Absolutely. It's a little trick that we learned actually from our friends over in Wales at Penderyn, because they had done this, and we went over to see them. We have a lot in common with Penderyn because we're both kind of sort of the standard bearers of our respective nations. They're kind of the number one whiskey in Wales, and we're the number one whiskey in England. And we also both worked with Jim Swan. So the flavor profile of our whiskey, our process has a lot in common. And we went over, and it's a really great business. People are really friendly, and they talk with each other, and Penderyn are kind of to us sort of something to aspire to, because they're about 10 years older than us, and they were real trailblazers. But when we were over there, they let us taste a whiskey. It was an unpeated whiskey, but aged in a ex-Lafroig quarter cask. And we thought it was wonderful because it just released just enough sort of phenols and just enough smokiness to not overwhelm the whiskey, but just to complement it, which is what we're looking for. What we believe in is balance. We believe in layered flavors. So we came home from that trip to Penderyn, and I said, let's do it. Let's buy one cask. I mean, we weren't exactly big risk takers then. And then when it was good, after 6 months, we said, let's buy two. And so we started pretty slow, but eventually we got to the point where we had several hundred of those wonderful ex-Lafroig quarter casks, which we now buy directly from Lafroig via Beam Suntory, who they belong to. We were talking as recently as yesterday about whether at some point we ought to actually do a traditional peated malt with smoked barley. And our problem is there's so many fun things to do in this business, and it's kind of challenging to try and do them all. And we have done an awful lot. I mean, we have made grappa, and we've made Calvados, and we've made lots of different, we've made rum, and it would be great to do everything, but it is difficult, especially with our ever-growing now whiskey range. But the peated cask is wonderful because it still has that DNA of Cotswold single malt, that just nice, rich, fruity kind of spirit, but then you get just that little bit of smoke, and it kind of takes you to a place that only peat can do, somewhere in the Western Islands or whatever. And it's just for those who like it, but it's also sort of a little bit of a gateway for those who don't think they like peated malts, because it's not in your face. It's one of our distillers called it smoky vanilla ice cream, which I thought was a wonderful way of putting it. Yeah.
Perhaps you go to Heston Blumenthal. In fact, I can introduce it.
There we go. Absolutely. That could certainly be interesting.
So in all these experimentations and distillery in general, any big muck-ups that you've had, any big mistakes that have happened?
Well, I mean, the whole thing is, individual little things. We actually, when you're doing everything manually, as we are, and we believe in that. We believe in really that everything should be done the traditional way. There's just no end of room for that. And the fact that there's not more is a testament to the incredible discipline that our distillers have in executing this kind of recipe, basically, this process. Every day the same way, but not by plugging into a computer, but by literally turning the valves themselves, figuring out, But we've had, the first one I think came on day 4, day 5, when we were doing our first run of gin, and one of our former distillers, won't be named, managed to drop a screwdriver into a still full of alcohol and all the botanicals ready to go, and there was a screwdriver in it. So let's just say that he actually had to wade into the still to get said screwdriver. And that was at that point I left. I walked out of the room. I couldn't bear to watch anymore, but it all turned out to be okay. And the gin was as wonderful as it always is. But we've done lots of things, I think, particularly in the area of gin. I think in general, with me, it was all about kind of figuring it out from a base of zero knowledge, because I had as much knowledge of making whiskey as anybody who goes on a couple of whiskey tours and finds the whole thing absolutely wonderful and romantic and whatever, but nothing else. And so the message that I've always tried to get out to people is if you too feel compelled to do something because you've thought about it, you've seen it or whatever, life is short, go take the chance, go follow your dreams. Absolutely.
I'm hoping the magazine will eventually lead to leading else open distillery, but it's down the line.
Absolutely.
You've got in front of us as well, you've got a kind of new release here. The Reserve. Tell me a little bit about
Absolutely. Well, this is This is a wonderful whiskey that we are just launching now called Cotswolds Reserve. And it's meant to be sort of one of our flagship, one of our sort of entry-level whiskeys in that it's got a price tag that's approachable just as the whiskey itself is approachable. And where it differs from our signature, Cotswold Signature, which is the first single malt we ever released, in that that whiskey, which we released when it was exactly 3 years old, was 70% ex-red wine cask, 30% first fill bourbon. So it gets all that wonderful fruit and a little bit of chocolate and coffee sort of from the this toasted and charred ex-red wine cask, but then it gets some of that nice maltiness from the first fill bourbon. But because those ex-red wine casks mature they sort of extract so much more quickly, that's why that dominates in our signature whiskey. The difference with that is Reserve, we've actually flipped it around, and it's 80% first fill bourbon and only 20% STR. And that's because the whiskey in here is a couple of years older. So the barrels in here will be a minimum of 5 years old. We don't make a big thing of age here. We really believe it's not how many years are on the outside of the bottle, it's how you like it. If you ever want to know whether you like a whiskey, don't look at the label, just smell it and taste it. But the fact that bourbon casks typically do take a few more years to sort of make their mark on a whiskey. Those extra couple of years have made it so that the bourbons are absolutely lovely. In fact, we also released 100% bourbon cask this fall at cask strength. So that bourbon gives you the much more traditional whiskey drinkers whiskey. It really shows off our single malt, our DNA. And then that 20% of STR still gives you that just really Moorish little sweetness on the side that just makes it a dram you kind of want to just keep drinking. Not that we encourage that, but it's a Moorish dram, and I would place it alongside our other flagship as the slightly more elegant, more sophisticated cousin. Our sort of signature is big, bold, and brash, and just big fruit-forward, sweet flavors, and this is a little bit more elegant. And it's at 50% ABV, so it's a slightly higher ABV, but it drinks really nice that way, or with whatever amount of water one likes to drink. But the two of them together are just probably a great pair expressing who we are. And then after that, we've got all these nice kind of higher-end, higher ABV single type of cask whiskeys like sherry and peated, etc. But I'm fast falling in love with this one.
Brilliant. So, wasn't ever a time where, or the first time you ever walked into a bar, a hotel, and you just saw your bottle on the shelf there?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's been so many of those experiences, but of course the ones that really, after all these years of lots of stuff happening to us, can still stay in memory are the kind of real iconic places. And I can think of nowhere more iconic than the American bar of the Savoy Hotel in London. Now, this is the place that gave birth to so many wonderful cocktails and cocktail culture, sort of, and it's a place where the bigger companies will pay extortionate amounts of money just to have their bottles behind the bar. So imagine the joy when I sort of walked in and saw, without any kind of paid promotional consideration, a bottle of our Cotswolds dry gin and a bottle of our Cotswolds single malt proudly sitting behind the bar. There is a great backstory to this because one of the senior bar people at the American bar at that time, in fact, actually, she was a bar woman, and she was one of the first senior female bartenders at the Savoy, at the American bar, in 100 years or something like that, comes from a village next door to us. And she's a beautiful blonde girl who, with her white Savoy jacket, looked absolutely perfect. But I've seen her out here in her wellies and her muddy, barber, and she loves to go off, yomping in the hills, which is kind of what I think the message that we are trying to be is that, we're in the middle of nowhere. We're in a beautiful, very rural part of the country, but we polish up pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you order a glass?
I ordered several. I wasn't driving, so I could fully enjoy myself, and I might even go back there tonight, actually.
Fantastic. And just wrapping up, is there anything people should know about Cotswold Distillery that you perhaps feel isn't written about enough?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that to to visit us is to know us and to understand us. And as much as, we want you to try our products, we want you to buy our products wherever it's convenient. I mean, we're nowadays, we're the first English whiskey in Sainsbury's and in Tesco and Waitrose, and we're really proud of that. We're proud that we are an approachable whiskey, both in terms of flavor profile, but also in terms of price. And you can get us all around. We're on Ocado, we're on Amazon, on our own website, even online. But what you really get when you come to visit us is you get an understanding of who we are and why I set this place up where, I literally built a distillery as an excuse to be able to live here as opposed to moving here to build a distillery. It is just such a gorgeous part of the world. And we built a gorgeous visitor center, which we're sitting in right here. And it's got a cafe and 4 open fires. And you can sit here and nurse a cup of coffee the whole day if you want, or go out, take a walk and come back. And we've got amazing walking paths that, right from the distillery. You can just take off and go for a walk up in the hills. So I'd encourage anybody that's interested to come visit us. We're an hour and a half from London, and you won't be sorry you did.
Dan, thank you very much indeed for your time. Hugely appreciate it.